Hey, deserving listeners, let's continue watching Baby Reindeer. I've already watched the whole series, but I'm going back and reviewing.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay, I'm not going to watch, but what can we say about his personality? Well, what's being depicted is sadistic and psychopathic behavior. Not only does he exhibit the lack of empathy and lack of remorse, but also a desire to harm, and specifically sexual sadism, where he gets off on harming other people. He is sexually turned on by exploiting and drugging and doing things to someone that they don't want to do. In fact, they might find it very, very uncomfortable. In fact, they might have an extreme negative reaction to it. That's what gets them off, because he's a man of power. Presumably he has connections and social skills. If he just wanted to have sex, he could do it, right? Or pay for it or something. You know, if it's just sex, then there's easier routes and more gratifying routes, right, that are available. So when individuals resort to this, like with Bill Cosby or with Harvey Weinstein, then they must actually want that context of rape where the individual, the victim, doesn't want it. And we understand this. We've seen this for centuries, but in our field, it's something we've studied for, decades and decades. And it's called sexual sadism or sadistic personality disorder. And as a subset, they manifest through sexuality. This is a desire and a pleasure with harming other people, seeing other people being harmed. And these individuals might do the harming themselves, or they might vicariously get this satisfaction by witnessing other people being harmed or watching harm happen online, videos, this kind of thing. Also, these individuals, and this is not S&M. This is not BDSM. It's the same word, right? Sadomasochism within sexual play and role play, right? Kink, this sort of thing. This is not that. Now, sometimes these individuals will enter that world as a way to try to get their satisfaction, but the typical BDSM kink community knows that, and they have very robust rules and principles and safety mechanisms in place to weed out people like this, because they know the difference between someone who actually wants to harm other people and wants the victim to feel harmed, as opposed to playing like you feel like you're harmed. I don't need to explain more than that. I don't think. I hope I don't need to. So completely different topic and completely different motivation. People who are involved in the BDSM community, they don't want actually to harm other people. It's sort of like a more vanilla example is to be a little rough with sex, or to play around with, binding or something, or talking dirty. And some dirty talk can be degrading, if you just looked at the sentence verbatim. And, pretty common scenario. I can't remember the stats, but a high percentage of people are turned on by that, whether they do it or not in their lives. But when we survey people, they'll say, oh yeah, that sounds nice. That is not this, right? Okay. This is, I want the individual to feel, when you're just vanilla playing around, that the person you're doing this to is not actually feeling harmed by it. And you're playing with something, you're on the edge of something, and you might even think of it as a loving act of just like, I know you like it when I call you that name while we're doing it. And so this is me loving you by, because I'm not into this kind of stuff. So you get my point. Anyway, sexual sadism is a thing. It's a monstrous thing. It's a very rare thing. Another aspect we're seeing is Machiavellianism. So the dark tetrad, you can listen to my episodes on that, are Machiavellianism, which is you're planning in advance. You scheme. You are even getting pleasure maybe from the planning it out. He plans this out. This is premeditated. It doesn't just suddenly happen. The typical psychopath, someone who has no remorse and doesn't care about other people and also is impulsive and maybe violent at times, if they don't have Machiavellianism, they're impulsively exploiting others. They don't plan in advance. They just react when other people are getting in their way. If you're psychopathic and Machiavellian, then you might do something like this. But if you're psychopathic, Machiavellian, and sadistic, then, and sexually sadistic, then that's when you see this. Those are three different constructs, three different personality traits that have a lot of overlap, but they don't necessarily coincide. The fourth in the dark tetrad is narcissism. And we don't see that from him in the way that we mean when we call it narcissistic. You know, people would say, oh, he's very self-centered or whatever, but he's not narcissistic in the way that Martha is presented. So this character, the Darien character that's based on a real human being, but this is a fictional character, definitely has psychopathy, lack of empathy and callousness, lack of remorse, definitely has Machiavellianism, and definitely has sadism, right? So he has 3 of the 4 dark tetrad traits, which adds up to a monstrous human being. These individuals are very rare, very, very rare. You could live your whole life and never even walk past someone like this in public. They're extremely rare, but they're out there and they cause a lot of trouble. And if they have power, like he does, that's another aspect of this, is that he uses his power, maybe even was attracted to a position of power so that he could exploit others. And it points to how in the entertainment industry, apparently the culture is such that allows for people like this to exist, because we've heard so many stories, like with the Nickelodeon thing, which I haven't even talked about on the podcast. I know a little bit about it. My wife watched the documentary series and said I should watch it, but I just haven't had time. At some point, I imagine I will. But for some reason, you know, the casting couch, this kind of thing, that culture needs to change, because we're not going to stop this from happening by just catching the few individuals that manage to be outed by victims. One could argue that only those individuals that were doing this to people who victimize people who just for whatever reason eventually do have the power or nothing to lose, like with, you know, some individuals are just like, well, I'm no longer in the entertainment industry, so I don't care if I burn bridges at this point. So it's happening now. It'll happen tomorrow. It'll happen next week. It'll happen next month. It'll happen next year, probably at the same rate that it was happening over the past 20 years. It's not going to change until we drastically overhaul the entertainment industry, apparently in multiple contexts, maybe around the world, right? And we have awareness and we have systems in place to help people to know that they can come forward, and a justice system and a police system that is trained to respond to victims when they do sheepishly show up at the police station. Okay, so I skipped ahead because I know what happens. This is afterwards, and he's waking up. Another point to bring up is that this is another insidious aspect of this kind of assault and abuse, is that you'll wake up, and given the messages that we've all been given in society, there's a natural tendency to blame the self, of like, well, I didn't say no, or I didn't fight back enough. And then you think, well, I deserved it, or maybe I wanted it, or I'm not strong enough, or if I tell people about this, they're not going to support me because I didn't fight back enough. And in the past, the United States, and still to this day to some extent, and certainly in other cultures around the world, they will say, well, did you fight tooth and nail the entire time? Otherwise, it's your fault, which is just like the dumbest thing. Yeah. Now, with Martha, when she turns a corner and is compassionate, the way it's depicted, it looks sincere. This does not. This does not look sincere at all. This is all part of the plan. This is all part of the psychopathy and the sadism of how do I manipulate this person? How do I keep him, Donnie became acutely aware of the rape because of physical pain that he was experiencing in the shower. And he probably knew from experience that Donnie would feel that feeling or might know that, or at the very least feel upset about being harmed. And so the victimizer, the Darian character, he offers to be nice. And, that's what they will do often. And that's something that is not talked about, is that the abuse cycle. This is a particular horrendous, sadistic version of the abuse cycle. This isn't the typical, but in terms of the broad strokes, it is. The other element is that if you're Donnie, it would be nice if someone hugged you and showed you some compassion, because you're alone and you don't have anyone to turn to, and so this could feel good. And then another reason to feel shame, like, well, maybe I want this, and then you can become dependent. This is what is often the cycle with the sex workers and the high control pimp, right? Is through coercive control, physical harm, maybe even sexual harm, and then, hey, baby, I got you. Like, I'm on your side. You have both the monster and the comfort person in the same person, right? And it's isolation and shame and control and horrificness. And yeah, it's depicted well here.
I would love to say I left, that I stormed out and never went back, but I stayed for days afterwards. In fact, come Monday, I got an eye infection and lay on his floor as he bathed it in salt water.
Yeah, I think I forgot about that line. Yeah, and what a brave soul, Richard Gadd, to risk it. And again, kudos to Netflix, because they could have said, you got to tone that down a little bit. And maybe it was toned down. I don't know. Certainly not much. But anyway, for Donnie, the fictional character, he's telling us that, I wish I could tell you I left, but I didn't. I stayed another 9 days. And yeah, that isn't always the case, but it's a common scenario. And, I'm old enough to remember the various different moments in time that our culture is focusing on a movie or a TV show or a story like Harvey Weinstein or the Me Too movement, of progression down the line, down the road of recovering as a society and becoming more aware. And over time, I'm old enough to see that the stories get more sophisticated. In the beginning, you can't tell a nuanced story because people wouldn't understand it. You have to tell an exaggerated story, like that movie with Jodie Foster called The Accused. It's a real story, but it doesn't have nuance to it, really. I mean, it has some nuance to it, but the story is unambiguous to the audience. You're not going to find a lot of people to be like, well, maybe there are some, like she was dressed like she, anyway. It wasn't hard to digest and say that's wrong, right? If we showed Baby Reindeer in the 80s, because I think that's when that movie was, I think our society wouldn't be able to handle it. But I think we've gotten to a point, because my gauge on the public reaction is generally 99% on board with the message, which is that this is abuse and that it gets complicated, and victims and the mentality and the trauma that you go through and the difficulty. I will say that I'll see articles written and they'll say, like, it has to do with mental health. And that word, I don't use it in that way, because I think that others it. Not, 50% of Americans will qualify for a diagnosis in the DSM. So having a mental illness isn't strange or abnormal or rare. It's more the norm than not. But this notion of that he suffers from a mental illness, I don't see any mental illness. I don't see any DSM diagnosis being presented to us. I'm trying to think. I don't see any. I just see victim. I just see a victim. I see someone that doesn't have any character. Now, maybe if we knew the actual person and maybe he had some phobia or propensity to depression. I mean, I guess we see like drug problems. So I guess that's diagnosable, but that's not typically what we're thinking of when we're saying words like mental illness. So I want to push back against that. But my point is that I'm quite happy that people see it that way, that this could be made, that this could be greenlit, that it could be written so well and with so much nuance by a man who was victimized by a man and a woman in different ways, and have it be entertaining enough for people to watch and have people watch it along those lines. And how far we've come down the road and how hard we've worked as a society to get to this point where we could handle something like this. And I want to pat my profession on the back and say, we have been working our asses off to get us down the road for decades and decades. I want to say this because so often, particularly if you're younger and you haven't seen the result of that it can feel demoralizing when you bump up against ignorance and oppression. And it just seems like we're never going to get out of this. When we all put our minds to it collectively and we do the right moves, or mostly the right moves, we'll get down the road. And that's just how long things take. So trust and believe. And this parallels with the same thing. I'm reminded of all the times I've told novice clinicians that are dealing with very entrenched issues of personality or behavior or pattern or conflict. And they will be working with a client for maybe 3 years, and they don't see any evidence of the client being any better now than when the client first entered their office 3 years ago. And first off, I will say, well, let's really look at it, because there are some things we can say that are improvements. And it takes a long time to get better, and you have to have faith, believe me. And this is where mentorship comes in. It's not just me telling them, it's us having a very in-depth relationship so that they feel held and understood, and they believe me. They have faith in me. As I tell them, you have to have faith in the process and the clients. We can't predict that things are going to work out in the end, but believe me, with clients like this, I don't see progression much in the first 3 years either. But 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, you'll definitely see improvements and change. You might not see it if you just think about the past 6 months, but when you compare now to 5 years ago, there will be a drastic difference, especially if you know where to look. And it's not hard to find it if you know what you're doing as a therapist. But anyway, so in that same way, I am very optimistic about our society, because imagine where we'll be in another 50 years.
Time. And what was he getting from it? Was it simply a desire to corrupt? To achieve whatever his sick mind wanted to achieve? Was that the turn on? To ruin my life?
Look, do you want to watch something instead? I'm not feeling it.
Yeah. So he's just now recovering from having been assaulted for 10 days. And his former partner, I think, is now wanting to roll around. And because he doesn't have the support and he doesn't know what to say, or he doesn't want to talk about it yet, he has, I'm just not feeling it right now, which would be totally understandable. And this can further alienate victims, right? If she gets huffy about this.
Hey, shut up.
And I kind of forgot that this depicts well that when we have partners that say they're not feeling it, we need to listen and not just be like, you just need to be coaxed into it, or, but I want to do it right now.
I'm sorry, it's just not happening today.
And there's so many things I could say. about this because this is a common topic that clients will talk with therapists about. It's a common enough trauma, common enough experience post-trauma. But one thing I'll say is that one of the things that is necessary for recovery is for the victim to establish power and boundaries about their body again. Unfortunately, sometimes they have to establish that power and boundaries with a safe person, like someone who doesn't abuse them. And that means that their current partner, who might have nothing to do with the harm that happened to them, might have to suffer from that pushback. And that's why I work with couples, typically, if I can, or at the very least, I'll meet with the spouse occasionally to bring them in and help them understand. I've never had a spouse that pushed back once they understood. They're like, oh my God, yes, of course, I love my partner. I want to do whatever we can. And if that just means, they push back or establish boundaries or we don't do it for a while, like totally cool. But to expect a partner to understand that without having it being explained to them, at least explained to them well, it's too much to ask.
And burning his body to the ground. So after months of hate and anger...
So I won't show this scene because I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be able to be shown on YouTube, but he talks and shows how he starts to go down a road of pornography and masturbation that he wasn't usually into, that had to do with leaning into the act of being assaulted. And he starts to question, is this a thing of mine? Do I now want to do this? And I don't know if he says this in the depiction or not, but one hypothesis is that it's the individual trying to gain control over what happened to them. And without trauma recovery and without support, victims will resort to just about anything to recover, right? Including a very common thing that will emerge for them is they'll lean into the harm. They might even start dating someone that is likely to harm them again. They might even ask people to harm them again. And this is where kink and BDSM can actually be helpful, because if it's a community that understands all this sort of thing, there could be therapists that are in the kink BDSM community. I supervised a therapist, a very good therapist, who was in the Seattle BDSM kink community, and so he would know that how to detect that sort of thing. And so you'd be able to help someone to enter that world and use it to recover, to gain back the power or regain trust. Anyway, but without that sort of support, then you could be confused by it and think, well, maybe I want this. Again, it's that running up against the wall, and you don't know how to get out of it, and you can just materialize a door in the wall by saying, I wanted to do it. And neurologically, you can start to be that way and physically get turned on by it, maybe only turned on by it, right? So we're seeing that depicted well here.
Situations where I would almost risk being raped again in this attempt to understand the first time. Like if I'm passed around like a whore, then I might at least shed this idea that my body is part of me somehow.
Another very common syndrome is, by leaning into it, the individual, the victim, is saying, well, at least I have power over it. At least I'm dictating when it happens to me, which is a part of getting power back, right? You're having the power to determine when you're powerless. It's a compromise, right? Of course, it's not overall helpful, because you want the individual to have all the power, meaning that they can have the power to say that they don't want it to ever happen again, and they have the power to say yes or no. The other problem is that if individuals like Donnie have been raised in a way where they've been either sufficiently divorced from their emotions and their needs and their feelings, or they never developed it, then they might not have a self to turn to know, do I want this or not? It might sound strange, but if you haven't been raised well enough, or you've been abused sufficiently enough, and you go through things like this, you'll feel uncomfortable and you'll feel like it's not a good thing that's happening, but you don't have, like, for me, I was raised well enough, and if I go through something like this, it's hard to know what would happen if I went through all of this, but if I went through just one instance of it, then I would, with some exploration, I would be able to easily turn to a self and a stable identity of who I am and what I want and how I feel about things, to know I didn't like that, and I do like this other thing. Like, this stuff I like and that I didn't like. If you don't know who you are, if you're not in connection with your emotions and your needs, then you don't have that thing to contrast with. You're just turning to emptiness. And so you're like, well, I don't know what I want. So I know this isn't great, but I don't know what's the alternative. And especially if you've never experienced the alternative, which I think he has because he had that previous partner, then you really have, it's common for people to be in middle age and having never experienced, or maybe their whole life, and have never experienced consensual sex.
If you want to do aqua aerobics, right, you don't need to ask me like 5 million times.
Excuse me, sir, can I?
I will say, at a certain point, I think it was this point in the end of episode 4, that I started to not appreciate the tone shifts, because the way that this show is talked about is that it's a comedy, I think, is the way people are talking about it. And it certainly has comedic elements, for sure. And it starts that way. In the beginning, it was very interesting. It was comedic. It was sort of light in tone, but it was getting a little bit of dark, dark comedy, that kind of stuff, like Fargo or that kind of thing. And then when we get to episode 4, I'm like, oh, no. This is nowhere near a comedy. This is more real than most, like Manchester by the Sea, that kind of stuff. Like, there's comedic moments, but no one says that movie's like comedy. It's too real. It's too raw. This is way more raw and real than that sort of thing. So, like, the movie I thought about when I was watching this episode was the movie Irreversible, a French movie that, if you've never seen it, I don't know what to say. Again, in the middle of the movie, there's a very horrific scene that would trigger just about anybody. And I saw that movie when, like 25 years ago or something. It was the first movie that I'd seen that was like that. And anyway, it's a fascinating movie because the premise is that it's all one shot. Of course, it's not all one, like 1911, that movie. And it goes backwards in time. It's a fascinating, it's like Memento in that way, and very interesting movie. But there's a few scenes that make it very hard to watch. Anyway, so I was thinking about that, and no one thinks of Irreversible as like this. So when they get to this ending of episode 4, and it's tonally going back to that first tone of just like light and funny and dark comedy sort of tone, I just thought, no, we've crossed the Rubicon. You can't go back to that tone. I'm not going to go with you back to that tone.
Did I miss her? Was there some part of me that missed her? Missed the drama, missed the attention, missed the distraction from him and Terry and myself and what happened, and did I miss her?
Yeah, a very common feeling, particularly with that kind of abusive individual, with that kind of stalker, because she wasn't a monster like the guy was. There were tender moments, there was an ego boost that he experienced, and it was a distraction. She was a more tolerable monster than the first one. And then you start to wonder, do I miss her? And if I were there, I would say, it's okay to miss her. It's okay to miss the good times. That's okay. You don't have to feel ashamed. The problem is that if they're alone, they start to think, I deserved it, or I was wrong, or they start to gaslight themselves, or they think all or nothing, like, well, if I miss them, I must actually want it, so I must go back to them. And it's okay. And I'll tell you, if you have these feelings, it's okay to have those feelings are just feelings. Another example of this is, say you break up with someone. It's not abusive, but you just say the relationship has run its course, or you don't want to be with him anymore for whatever reason. You break up. And then a year later, you see him on Instagram and you miss him and your heart is warm and you remember the good times. And now, maybe you should go back to them. I don't know. But typically, people will conclude that's not the path for them. And yet they still have these feelings. And you can just tell yourself, it's okay, it's normal, it's human. It would be bizarre and potentially psychopathic if you didn't have those feelings, because you did have good moments with that person. And you, of course you do miss that. Of course you do have warm feelings about that. And that's okay. That doesn't mean you have to go back with them. It just means you carry with you the good times. That's what he's doing. That's all these do. Another aspect that they were kind of hinting at is that she has completely avoided him, presumably because she's terrified about going back to prison, or she's trying to manipulate him, which sometimes they, stalkers or abusive people will do. It's like, okay, I know you need me kind of, so I'm just going to completely go cold turkey with you. It's more likely that she's just terrified to go to prison in terms of the way it's being presented. But for him, it was comforting when he knew where she was. This is a very insidious aspect of what it's like to be a victim, of if I can at least keep my eye on my abuser, then I know when the abuse is coming, or I know how to, I can get my hands on the abusive person, not physically necessarily, but I can maybe direct the abuse in a certain way. I can dictate, or at least I'll know when it's happening, or I'll see the signs, like when they're getting upset, and here it comes. But when you don't have contact with them, you don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know where or when or what direction, and you're constantly looking over your shoulder. It's sort of like, it's a completely different thing. It's more metaphorical, that when you're suffering from some kind of health problem, and you go to doctors and physicians and biologists and others, and they can't figure out what's going on with you. And then eventually you keep fighting, and eventually they're like, oh, you have a rare form of cancer that will likely kill you within the next few years. People will feel relief in that situation. Not always, but they often will. Even though the prognosis is horrible, but they have an answer. They know what's going on now. It's a thing. It's understood, and there's relief that can occur for people. And it's ironic in that way, because it's like, well, before there were a lot of options available, including not dying in 3 years. Now, but we like to know what's going on. We're that kind of creature. Sometimes we'll just make stuff up, like the sun is going around the earth, because we just don't understand things. We want to know. We can't just say, well, who knows? We have to invent answers. That's how much we want an answer. And so when you are being victimized and the abusive person, there's a big question mark about where they are, what they're thinking, what they're doing, when and if abuse is going to come. You would almost rather have them close and know when the abuse is happening than live in a world where you're more likely not to be abused, but you don't know what's happening and you don't have eyes on the abusive person. This is where support comes in, and therapy and advocacy and protection. Because in all likelihood, if he could feel supported and he felt like he had people he could depend on and a system to run to in an emergency, then he wouldn't feel this feeling that he wants to incorporate her back into his life, because he wouldn't need to feel that way, because that fear would be quickly answered of just like, well, if it comes out of nowhere, suddenly I have 10 or 20 contingencies to fight that. I have people near me, and I have a connection at the police force, and I have measures. We've made a plan. Here's the crisis plan. I've written it down on a card and laminated it so I don't have to remember it. I just say, okay, do this, do that, do that. That security can be a protective measure against another protective measure against going back.
Scott in the street yesterday.
Yeah, like by chance.
Did you ask her to send you a sexually threatening email?
No?
I want to make sure I get it right, though.
So this is another depiction of what I've already talked about, how when we have a system that doesn't support victims, they have to take matters into their own hands sometimes, and they'll either do it impulsively or they'll plan in advance. He planned in advance. He approached Martha. He got her to, or wanted to get her to say something to him so he could prosecute her or get her. And she was ready, Martha was ready, and recorded him, and is now using that against him, making, at the very least, him look like not a credible witness about his own victim status, but also possibly as the real stalker. He was following her. He was trying to coerce her in this moment. In the grand scheme of things, it was but a small little drop of water in a vast sea of her abuse of him. But that's how these things can be used against victims and can make victims look like the perpetrator. Perpetrators will almost always try to make the victim look like a perpetrator. Often they feel like the victim is a perpetrator. That's their distortion level. Yeah, another aspect of this story, and not all victim recovery paths are like this, of course, but many involve creativity as a healing measure. And that's what he's doing. He has an impulse to write. He's a writer and a performer. And he's like, well, maybe I can create, I can use that to process this, to expel it, to explain it, to get power over it, to help others in this situation, to maybe even get back at my abusers a bit. I can get control of the situation. I can write the lines and the behaviors of my abusers. I have power. It's a lot of helpful, healthy, healing aspects to this, I imagine, which is why I would predict this will get an Emmy for Best Script. I don't know the exact, or a Golden Globe as well, right? Not that that's the end-all be-all, who cares? But I'm just saying that the significance of this, I think, will be understood, I hope anyway, at least nominated. But point is that the creativity, we can all think about that, and we've all been harmed. We've all dealt with it, grief and recovery and trauma and victimization and discovery. We all have that. How can we use our creative side to heal? And for those of you who don't think of yourself as being a creative person, I guarantee you're a creative person. It's this horrific aspect of our contemporary society that only the best of the best get to call themselves a musician or an artist or whatever. Plus, there's things that we don't consider to be creative that are absolutely creative, like landscaping or, dealing with plants or whatever. The way you dress, there's lots of different ways. Composing a tweet, making a podcast. There's a lot of different creative aspects to those things. We just don't usually think of them as being classically creative endeavors. You don't have to do that, but it can be a powerful way. And some of the best art, if not all of the best art, has been motivated by that desire to heal and understand and gain power and process and tell the story.
It's 7:25.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, man. I think I've left my wallet at home.
Don't worry about it. It's on me.
Yeah, it's a brilliant ending. It's hard to know exactly what the message is, but there's a how do you wrap up a story like this, I guess, is one of the questions, other than having a mirror being presented before the character of maybe you're not so different than Martha, right? He just got done getting back in business with the Darian character to work on eventually getting to the point of making a Netflix show, by the way. And then he wanted to be comforted, so he started listening to voicemails left by Martha telling him that he's a good person as a way to help him feel like he's a good person, because he felt so ashamed for having to get back in business with Darian. And then he is treated in the same way that he treated Martha that one day by saying, don't worry about it. And now we're left wondering, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that Donnie starts to stalk that bartender? I guess that's the question, right? And maybe the realization is, well, maybe this is what happened to Martha. Maybe Martha went through all this, and then this is the turning point where you become primarily the abuser. Hurt people. Or I don't know. I don't know what it's exactly saying. Or he just identifies with her, or he's just further confused. I don't know. But it's a brilliant ending, and it doesn't have a nice little happy ending. It's actually a pretty sad ending, a pessimistic ending, a realistic ending. Now, we suspect that things do get better for him because eventually he's doing the play and then the TV show, and hopefully he's recovered sufficiently. I don't think you could write a script like this without having recovered at least somewhat, right? So I guess we don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I think that would be the assumption, but we wouldn't know. I've worked with clients that were pretty early in recovery, and yet they could handle creating things like this or advertising their story. Not advertising, but being somewhat public, or at least among their circle. Anyway. But yeah, so good show. Powerful, impactful, noticeable, unforgettable. Let me know what you think, and check in with yourself, truly. Take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.